And there's a major demotion given to the Bible. So the Bible is not in the progressive movement viewed in its entirety as the Word of God. It's not viewed as authoritative for our lives.
People asking, define progressive Christianity, define what's a heresy, and define what's a false teacher. Help us with that.
Yes, it's important. It's always important to define our terms, isn't it? Because then we can just be talking past each other.
Right.
We don't have a good definition. So I'll start with progressive Christianity. So I've tried to hone my definition of this as I've gone along. And I think the most broad way to describe it, just the elevator pitch for progressive Christianity, is that essentially it's a group of people who call themselves Christians who are largely springing up and out of the evangelical church, but their theology and their philosophy are lining up with the theological side would line up with more the mainline Protestant, the liberal theology that came in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to where, it doesn't really matter what you believe about God. It's, if Jesus was raised from the dead or he wasn't, it doesn't matter. There's much deeper meaning we can glean from these great stories, and whether or not it really happened doesn't really matter. And there's a major demotion given to the Bible. So the Bible is not in the progressive movement viewed in its entirety as the Word of God. It's not viewed as authoritative for our lives. It's not viewed as internally coherent to where it would be telling the same story from Genesis to Revelation. They don't believe that it's doing that. It's filled with contradictions, errors, people disagreeing with each other. And so that's sort of the view of the Bible. And then the gospel is really seen as more of a works-based gospel. So it's really much more about what you do rather than what you believe. So progressive Christians are largely not creedal. They're not going to be united around creeds. They might give assent to the Apostles' Creed, or they might give a nod to it. But it doesn't really matter if that's what you really believe. It's really about what you do. And so acts of service, things like that are highly emphasized. Also, there's a strong emphasis on rethinking biblical sexuality. So affirming same-sex marriage would be necessary. If you were going to be a part of the progressive movement, that would be one of, a core tenet, I would say, of that movement. And so hopefully that kind of gives a broad flyover. We could drill down a little deeper into some of that if you want to. One other thing that would define progressive Christianity is its view of the atonement. So the atonement is largely rejected. The idea that God would require the blood sacrifice of his son, in the progressive mind, that implicates the character of God and turns him into a divine abuser. And so you can kind of imagine what effect that would have on the, right? That's why the gospel is much less about belief and much more about works.